This is Florida Gulf Coast University.
It's nearly impossible to get through the day without news and pictures from the Gulf of Mexico oil spill. But news tends to focus on the present, leaving great questions about the oil spill's future effects on the Gulf of Mexico and the states that share its borders. To consider that future and to provide a context for the present, we meet with a group of university scientists for their view of the oil spill in the Gulf on this FGCU Perspectives. Our guests are Jose Barretto, a professor of chemistry at FGCU, Darren Rumbold from FGCU's Coastal Watershed Institute and its program leader for marine science, and Everham, a professor of environmental studies at FGCU. Thank you all for being here. And Darren, let me start with you. The big question, I guess, how do you put this oil spill in some sort of perspective, especially for people in Southwest Florida?
That is a big question, because what they've been trying to do is put it in perspective in terms of how much has been released. And of course, every day, the amount that has been released for the last 2 months is changing because the volume coming out of the pipe has been re-estimated and recalculated. The problem is that's not the extent of it. It's to gauge the magnitude of this, you also have to look at the spatial area that's been impacted on the surface of the Gulf of Mexico. So it's not simply that you can compare it to the Exxon Valdez or the Ictoc 1 in the Gulf of Mexico years and years ago. It's really very hard to scale up and really appreciate the magnitude of this spill.
With that as a problem, though, how do you put it in perspective if it's not about how much is released?
Well, again, you have to kind of step back and take in the big picture. If we all focus on small areas, particularly when we start talking about the impacts, someone is going to have to scale it up and see how one area impacts, and you have a cascading effect impacting other areas. So you really do need to take the global picture of the entire Gulf of Mexico, because the entire Gulf of Mexico may be set back in terms of its environmental conditions.
Is it true, Darren? I mean, I think about when you're saying to think about that big scale. There's a lot of predictions that because of the loop current that we'll be spared in our immediate coast.
We in Southwest Florida.
We in Southwest Florida, yeah. Thank you, Kevin. And so I think it might be easy for us to think, oh, good, it's not going to impact us. But that scale of how much of the Gulf is being impacted can't avoid impacting us, at least indirectly in some way.
Exactly. And I was at a meeting 2 weeks ago, and there was a number of physical oceanographers in the meeting, and I actually mentioned that if Southwest Florida was to be spared from the brunt of the oil,
from the direct impact,
because we're going to get something. We're going to get tar balls or something. But even if we were, we might actually serve as a source for organisms to recolonize other areas, and that might have an impact on us.
Yeah.
But the interesting thing, in the room, I had several physical oceanographers, some of which I worked with at University of Miami in the past, said don't count your chickens before they hatch. There is some evidence that we may be getting some, the oil be moving down from, it's approaching Destin right now. It might actually be moving toward Panama City and moving further south. Some of that oil is coming around.
Rather than staying in the loop current. Yeah.
When one of your scholarly interests studying disruptions in the environment, you think about hurricanes or fire, an oil spill certainly factors into that same category.
Absolutely, yeah. I thought about, I haven't studied oil spills. So what is this idea of disturbance events from an ecological standpoint? What can I learn from that? And so one thing I think that study has shown is that systems will respond more rapidly to disturbances that they've experienced through evolutionary time. So I expect our coast to recover quickly from hurricanes because they've seen hurricanes for thousands of years. We expect the forests to be the species in our forests to be adapted to fires because they see fires once or twice a decade and have for thousands of years. It's difficult to begin to predict what the impact of a disturbance event that these species have seldom seen or never seen. That sort of takes it off of the realm of natural, and so I think that's one piece that we have to consider. Things are going to happen that we just can't anticipate, even with the stories from previous oil spills.
Right.
I think what Darren said before about thinking not in terms of how much oil was released, but in the geographic extent of its spread.
Right.
I think it's unprecedented. And so I think the ecological impacts are going to be surprising.
And Jose, scientists from all different fields looking at this oil spill with interest, what role does the field of chemistry play, the obvious and then maybe sort of the not so obvious?
Well, at some point we have to look at the scale of the spill, and there's going to be a very heavily polluted area, and then there will be fringes and plumes. And chemical analysis is expensive, so chemistry has to play this role. We need to go out there and analyze and look for the fringes and the sort of the what you might think are lightly impacted areas, but there's stuff in the water and it's hard to find. So we have to probably develop some tools that will let us see the oil at lower concentrations so we can see the real extent of this. I'd like to follow up on something about the volume, which I just read yesterday. There is an interesting piece of good news. The volume isn't always the whole issue. It's complex. In the Exxon Valdez spill in Alaska, it's so cold, and the microbes that decontaminate, they eat the oil and decontaminate the area. They are metabolically very slow, and in the Arctic, in some instances, in the soil and underneath the rocks, they're not as active. In the Ixtoc spill off of Mexico, 5 years later, it was hard to find the oil, even though that spill was really big. So we have an unprecedented problem. It's probably a little bit unique. The spill is enormous, but it's happening in an area where it might behave more like the Ixtoc spill. At least I'd like to put out sort of there's room to be optimistic also. If we could just turn this thing off, the system could probably roll it back faster than the Exxon Valdez case.
Right.
Lower latitudes, warmer temperatures,
Exactly.
more biotic potential.
Right.
Yeah, excuse me.
Yeah. No, I was going to say the same thing in terms of metabolic processing by the bacteria is going to be faster.
Yeah.
Hopefully, anyway. In terms of
I was actually
temperatures.
surprised. I wanted to mention this, that when I started to review and try to be prepared to answer your questions today, Kevin, that evidence from some of these spills in Panama of finding, at least in mangrove systems, finding oil residues 20 years after the event. Now that may have to do with the anoxic conditions that are present in those systems that are going to be different microbial.
Right. No, we're still going to have an
reactions,
anoxic, the issue of anoxia in the sediments of our estuarine systems.
Anoxia?
Low oxygen. I mean, even in the subsurface plumes that are being discussed now, out in the Gulf, there's an issue that it's drawing down the oxygen. The microbes are actually degrading the oil, the hydrocarbons in the oil, and they're drawing down the oxygen. If they run too low, they're going to, and they can be limited by oxygen, and also can be limited by other nutrients. So, in the past, people have actually attempted to try to introduce oxygen to these low oxygen environments to continue to stimulate that process. And if but as you pointed out, even in Panama, you still find the impacts and the oil a long time later. And the same thing up in the Massachusetts area where they had a spill back in '69. 30 years later, they still find oil in the sediments. But as I said, I agree with you 100%. We hope and we expect to have a faster degradation because of the temperatures down here.
And impacts, when you talk about impacts, finding oil on the beach is certainly an impact and not something any of us would hope for or look forward to. What other impacts come with an oil spill on beaches like ours, or estuaries like ours, shorelines like ours?
Oh, the potential impacts are numerous, and there's a lot of effort underway right now by various state and federal agencies to document any impacts that occur. And they're actually doing litigation science. They're out there doing what's called natural resource damage assessment. But they're going to be looking for direct impacts in terms of losses of mangroves or losses of oyster reefs or losses of corals or so forth, seagrass. And what we're interested in is the longer term potential indirect effects. What happens to the carbon export out of the estuary if you do lose mangroves and that leaf litter that you expect to be exported offshore. There's a lot of indirect effects that are going to take time to see, and we've got to be prepared to look for them in the long term.
Or you lose structure from direct mortality or reduced growth in mangroves, and suddenly that mangrove role of being a nursery for our fisheries changes.
Exactly.
There isn't as many places for organisms to attach to. There aren't as many places for small fish to hide. It isn't as good of a place for larger fish to feed. You know,
and that's the indirect kind of effect.
Yeah, right. and those things can last much beyond, you know, where you look at the system and say, wow, mostly 5 years later, I don't see the oil anymore and I still see mangrove trees, everything must be fine. Well, the mangroves are probably smaller, there's less leaf area, there's less roots, they're not performing their function as effectively, and I don't think we know how long those kinds of impacts.
And even a little thing that might seem ridiculously insignificant, like the study that showed that fiddler crabs in the Massachusetts area don't dig as deep because they run into the oil.
Yeah.
All right, so they dig down at a certain depth and then they go sideways because they don't want to dig into the oil. Well, those things are important in terms of bioturbation. They keep the air and all the gases that are in the sediments, and that improves the biogeochemistry of the sediments. So just the fact that it's not digging as deep might be changing the biogeochemistry of those sediments.
How crazy is that?
Even just tiny,
how
tiny
deep the
amounts.
crabs dig.
Exactly. So
ecology is not rocket science. It's much more complicated than that.
Yes.
And as we talk about these things, these direct and indirect impacts, are they things that you feel are coming to our part of the Gulf Coast?
Oh, I think we're going to see impacts, but they may be very subtle impacts. And as I said, hopefully we're not going to get the brunt of the direct impact of the glob of oil that is out there now, the globs that are out there now. But even if we get sheens, and there's some indication that the sheen that has expanded south is actually coming onto the West Florida shelf. Those sheens at the sea surface microlayer can be impacting the important plankton that are occurring right at the microlayer, and they're called neustonic organisms. And those things are very valuable in terms of commercial fisheries, but also in terms of ecological species, the significance of those species. I mean, you know, bluefin tuna have buoyant eggs. If those buoyant eggs are exposed to that oil, you might wipe out a year class, and then 3 years from now, when you start to expect to see small fish, you know, bluefin tuna, and then years after that come into the fishery, they may not be there. So it's going to take time. But, you know, the impacts are just amazing. That, you know,
I have little doubt that we'll be affected.
Little doubt that we will be affected.
Yeah, because largely what Darren pointed out is the geographic extent.
Yeah.
We may not even see tar balls.
Right.
I mean, it may seem like, wow, we were spared, but we are part of this larger interconnected system where the organisms that live on this coast move out into the Gulf and back from the Gulf, and we're connected through the water chemistry, and so what happens out in that Gulf is going to impact us. Now, it's really possible that we won't understand it and we won't see it.
Right.
You know, that the anoxic conditions that Darren was talking about happen on a relatively regular basis as the result of freshwater, nutrient-laden fresh water that comes down the Mississippi.
Sure,
so you get those
the
big,
dead zone.
the big dead zones, right. Mm-hmm. So one of the things we don't understand well at all in terms of disturbance ecology is the synergistic interaction between multiple disturbances. So will the impact of the oil spill be amplified or reduced by other things that are going to happen next year, the year after that, the year after that? You know, if we end up with a heavy rainy season next year that gives us a big dead zone in combination to whatever kind of dead zone is going to be associated with the oil spill, how will those two things interact with one another next year? We got no idea.
Could it neutralize it or could it make it worse?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Right. But we should keep in mind, and I think Jose was clear to bring this up, is that we're going to be surprised by the resilience as well.
Oh, yeah.
Sorry,
I was being a little bit
people
too...
in the Valdez area, although there's still a lot of debate as to whether there is some lingering injuries, people were completely surprised about how fast certain groups recovered. So it's not all gloom and doom. I mean, I guarantee that we're going to be surprised at how some groups recover faster than other groups of organisms.
But having said that, Darren, look at this acute effect. You know, it doesn't, the trouble, see, I'll say this immediately. If you take a tiny drop of oil and put it in a swimming pool, there will be a monomolecular layer of oil. I'm talking about a drop, a fraction of a drop. The surface area that covers is enormous, and that changes the surface tension of the water. Mm-hmm. Any organism that lives on that interface, how about a mosquito, will suddenly encounter a mosquito larva, for example, swimming at the interface, will encounter a brand new environment. And this sheen is enormous. I mean, it's huge. And you're not going to really see it. You're not going to really notice it. It is a monomolecular layer of oil. So I think the acute impacts are enormous because of the volume of the spill and these issues of interfacial phenomena. And I'm hopeful that longer term, then maybe because we're in a temperate zone, the system can recover. But the biology people know more about this than I do, for sure.
Now, are there things with those as your sort of best educated, I don't want to use the word guess, but the look at what is likely to happen? Does that change with any mitigation effects? Are there things that can be done
That's interesting. I can start with an answer. One of our graduate students is just finishing up some work after Hurricane Charlie, looking at replanting mangroves following Charlie's impact in the Upper Charlotte Harbor. And again, from this disturbance ecology standpoint, you think that ecosystems should be able to recover on their own from things that they have seen through thousands of years. But the edge of what we understand about that part of ecology, where we've got this synergy of different disturbances, I've said many times in public that when Charlie hit our coast, a hurricane had never hit our coast with this much altered hydrology, this much altered shoreline, this many boats, this many cars, this many exotic species. And so, again, it's unexpected as to what's going to happen there. And I think in that context, you can't sit back and say Mother Nature can recover herself. Jose is right. Natural systems have tremendous capacities for recovery, but that shouldn't cause us to say it'll all take care of itself. That we should be thinking about how are we going to replant mangroves in places where they've been lost? How are we going to stimulate the recovery of some of our fisheries? Because I do believe they would recover, but it may be a difference between decades or years, and we probably can't afford to wait decades because of the other stresses that are on the system.
Right.
So, sorry, you were going to
But, again, when they've already undertaken a couple of mitigation measures that may actually come back and prove more harmful than good. I mean, there's a lot of discussion about the dispersant. Yeah. I think in the long run we're going to find that the use of the dispersant was a bad idea, and they're going to have to consider other dispersants in terms of cleaning some of the salt marshes if they haven't already done so. But not only that, but you can also have unforeseen outcomes of taking management actions. But up in Exxon Valdez, they actually closed down one fishery to protect the human health issues in terms of exposure to the polyaromatic hydrocarbons, and the fishery, it changed because the fish were not being harvested.
People weren't harvested.
Yeah, so they actually the juveniles, they actually did have a good recruitment that year, and the juveniles over-predated their prey, and then the subsequent year they had a problem. So you have to be mindful when you make these major changes to the system that in terms of fisheries in particular.
And one of my biases, Kevin, if we can use your show, is that I think that people look in hindsight at those kinds of actions and say, how stupid were those people to do that? And the truth is, a whole bunch of people are going to have to be making decisions in areas that they've never done before with little data, and mistakes will be made.
Right.
But I believe that making the best decision that you can is the best you can do, and that we should accept the fact that some of the decisions we're going to make are going to be wrong, and go on from there.
Right.
And
just to bring in the Oil Spill Academic Task Force, about a week and a half into the spill, we formed a state university system oil spill academic task force. And one of the goals of that was to create a scientific resource to support decision making. So we actually get emails from the Department of Environmental Protection, and they need rapid responses to answer these questions, to feed that information back to the decision makers. So hopefully we're going to have some thoughtful decisions being made.
Yeah, that's a hard thing for academics to do. I mean, I'm glad you're wrestling with that. When people ask me, what should I do here? I say, boy, give me 5 years, let me set up an experiment, and then I'll tell you maybe what you should do. That's just the way scientists interact with the systems they study.
Is there not a lot to, I'm going to say to learn, but to have been learned from that 30 years ago, the large spill in the Gulf of Mexico on the Mexico side?
Well, again, the system is going to be different, particularly with the use, because there was so much use of the dispersants. And that was the question that came out, I think, today or yesterday, is how is that affecting the subsurface plume? Is the buoyancy issue, and the density issue, and where is that going to move, that sort of thing. So there's going to be a lot of things that are unique to this spill.
And the dispersant, from a chemistry standpoint, it's breaking the oil up before it has a chance to rise to the surface and float.
It's essentially a detergent, so it forms these tiny micelles in water, and the oil enters the micelle. And I think part of the reasoning is, all right, so if you get it very dispersed over a broad area, then maybe, for example, the microbes have a better chance to eat it. and that's an enabler. I'm not sure. Darren doesn't think that dispersants are a good idea. I don't know enough about it. I'm not sure if it is or it isn't. I do buy the argument that spreading it out over a large area and giving it more access to metabolic activity, maybe that's good. But
and there is, if I can interrupt, Jose, some evidence that if you hit a mangrove system with concentrated oil, it's going to have a more negative impact because you're really covering tissues and
you're smothering
causing
it.
You're smothering
right.
it, right.
And
so if you break it up first,
they may end up going into the salt marshes and the mangroves and actually clean them with a different form of corexant.
Yeah. Sorry to interrupt.
There's a physicality to oil killing.
Right.
You know, like all things have a cell membrane. It's very hydrophobic, and like dissolves like. So when the oil hits the membrane of a cell, it just dissolves it. I mean, essentially, to my knowledge, no organism lives in oil or solvent. They're just not evolved to do that. They live in water. You know, on this planet, the living things are in the water, and when they encounter these very oily environments, you know, they'll die. I mean, there are a few extremophiles. There's a type of fungus that lives on the edge of a diesel fuel tank, but doesn't live in the fuel. Right. It lives just above the interface. If it falls in the fuel, its membrane dissolves. So, and it's, you know, so the oil kills that way, and the dispersants are trying to prevent that sort of bulk effect, that sterilizing effect of all these solvents.
But if you keep the plume, if you get the plume down too deep, you lose the temperature advantage that we have because it gets cold.
And then the microbes there are few, and it's cold, and we're back to that exxon.
So there's always a balancing, you know.
I wanted to go back to your question a minute ago, Kevin, where you said, weren't there things that we should have learned from before? These guys are right that this is going to be different, but I would still argue that there were things we could have learned from before that would have better informed our decisions now. But I think as you look at the history of these kinds of events, we tend to respond to them reactively. We try to measure what we're doing, we make the best decisions we can, we do it, and then we forget about it.
Yeah.
So my prediction would be 5 years from now, there'll be very little work still going on asking what was the impact of that oil spill, and whatever it is, 10 years, 20 years from now, when another oil spill happens, we'll go, God, we missed those opportunities last time, didn't we? That's just the way we are as a species.
And it's going to be even worse, unfortunately, if there's a lot of institutions coming in from other parts of the country. The Oil Spill Academic Task Force really wanted to bring the research into Florida because we're going to be here for the long haul. If that money that BP has pledged for independent research goes elsewhere, and those institutions come into the Gulf, it'll be short term.
Oh yeah, because they'll come down, they'll do their stuff, they'll leave.
And they'll leave.
And then they're done.
And that's why we're continuing to pressure that Florida gets some money to do the long-term research.
Is there any sort of hidden advantage from the fact that this is a natural product? It's a man-made event that caused its release into the ocean, but it's something that exists in nature. It's not some strange concoction that we've polluted the waters with. It sounds like you talk about the microbes that are there, and it's
already
kind of their job to help break this up.
Different microbes will attack different components of the oil. The alkanes will go first, and then the aromatics. But the other aspect of it is that a lot of organisms can actually clear themselves of the oil. We've got various metabolic processes, phase 1, phase 2 metabolic processes that will clear the oil. Unfortunately, one group that doesn't do well in terms of clearing the oil, the polyaromatic hydrocarbons from their system, is oysters and bivalves. So that's why they're actually used as sentinels, because they tend to retain it for a long time. But fish and a number of other organisms, including us, can actually clear themselves over a period of time.
But as we talk about our estuaries, all around the Gulf Coast, from here to the top and down the side, oysters and
exactly, and there's going to be a long-term impact in terms of the PAH, the polyaromatic hydrocarbons in those oyster tissues, because they do not clear themselves very fast.
From a theoretical standpoint, there's evidence to suggest that if a particular disturbance event hits a system that has experienced lower intensity similar events, you know, if a hurricane hits a place that regularly gets a wind event, there will be some adaptations of the species that will enable them to better deal with this.
So even if it hasn't seen hurricanes, it's seen wind, something that approximates it.
Yeah, even if it hasn't seen an oil spill, if it's dealt with oil seepages. However, the other side to that is that there's also, I think, accumulating evidence to suggest that there is this scale issue, that the fact that you've seen windstorms before doesn't mean you're ready for a Category 5 hurricane, if we want to sort of make that
Right.
metaphor. The fact that you've got oil seeps doesn't mean you're ready for this kind of an oil spill. Now, so there's, you know, two sides to that issue. One is optimistic and the other is potentially pessimistic.
And there's other sources of PAHs besides oil.
Yes.
You have pyrogenic sources of PAHs in terms of a forest fire. Forest fire generates PAHs. There are different kind of PAHs, so you can actually differentiate the two.
I think the dose makes the poison.
Yes.
So the fact that it's a natural
Yes.
product. So what we're saying here is, and I've fielded a few questions from the community about human toxicity. You know, people saying, I'm afraid to go to the beach. What if there's oil in the water? Now, mind you, we don't have oil on our beaches yet, but so people are worried. So one of my answers was, well, see, it is a natural product. You are adapted to PAHs. You can consume them, and then they go to your liver, and then they're toxic, and then your liver detoxifies them. And because they're very hydrophobic, you have to hydroxylate them, make them polar, and excrete them, and this taxes the liver.
Right.
So and by the way, the hydroxylated products are carcinogenic. So here's the answer. It's a little bit is going to be okay, and a lot is going to be poisonous.
And on that, I'm going to stop you because we've run out of time for today. I want to thank you all for being here, and thank you for watching this edition of FGCU Perspectives.